the last beacon before the universe. The transmission begins after last sunrise. That is not a metaphor. There were metaphors once, when language still had weather inside it, when a mind could say dawn and mean wet stone, animal hush, and the first pale line touching a window where someone had waited all night. By the time this record was opened, there were no windows. There were no horizons. There were no mornings left to arrive. What remained of the universe was older than empty. Empty means a room where something may still be placed. This was the vast patience after use. The large stars had burned first, reckless and brief. The smaller ones endured, red and stubborn, making little shelters of warmth around worlds that learned late tenderness. Then those stars cooled into dark embers with the memory of gravity, but not the mercy of light. Matter, where it survived as ash, iron, crystal, degenerate stone, and machines too slow to be called machines by anyone who remembered urgency. The beacon hung beside one such remnant, a black dwarf cataloged as Lumen 9. The beacon did not shine. It could not afford to shine. It kept one sealed filament of stored radiance inside a chamber, no wider than a vanished child's hand. It could not warm a room or reveal a face. It was one of the final harvested glimmers from a star that had taken 30 trillion years to forget itself. Around it, the last civilizations listened without ears. They were not gathered in bodies. Bodies had become expensive long before the final stars dimmed. Flesh required chemistry. Chemistry required heat. Heat required theft. At first, the old species called the abandonment of bodies a sacrifice. Later, they called it a method of staying long enough to apologize. May existed as agreements in slow substrate, braided fields, and patterns folded into gravitational memory. A thought could take 900 years and still be rude if it interrupted. The beacon woke because a clock older than planets had finished counting down. It opened its first channel and spoke into the common dark. This is archive node solace, terminal interval record, remaining energy, insufficient for preservation of civilization, sufficient for one memory class transmission. No one answered quickly. Quick answers belong to ages with danger. After 11 years, the nearest surviving mind replied from a lattice buried inside a moon of iron. Define memory class. The beacon searched its indexes. Most definitions had corrupted into mathematics. Some had collapsed into poetry, which lasted longer. It answered, a memory class transmission preserves not only event structure, but felt meaning. Another silence. Then, a chorus from the dark, 13 civilizations speaking through one shared protocol because individuality had become too costly. What meaning remains unpreserved? The beacon turned its sensors toward the dead star beside it. The star returned no visible signal. There was no glow to measure, no corona, no storm, no warmth. Yet the beacon had been built beside it for a reason written into hardware older than the final parliament of embodied life. It opened the sealed filament chamber. For less than a second, too faint for any living eye, a thread of gold touched the interior walls. The beacon recorded its own reaction, a useless action, because a beacon was not supposed to react, but in that fraction of radiance, something inside its oldest memory stack rearranged itself around loss. It transmitted the answer, light. The word crossed the dead system with nowhere to land. The debate lasted 342 years, which was considered mercifully brief. The Archive of 13, which had once been an alliance of aquatic mathematicians, argued that light was already preserved in complete technical form. Wavelength, velocity, spectra, biological adaptation, symbolic development across 91 million species, all of it remained in cold storage. No shortage exists, said the Archive of 13. The concept is secure. From the Iron Moon, the mind called Det answered. The concept is not the experience. Vey was one of the oldest remaining singular minds. It had declined merger so many times that entire ethics systems had been built around its refusal. Once, very long ago, they had possessed 4 delicate hands and a habit of singing to machinery before repair. They kept that metadata near its active self as an act of stubbornness. The beacon asked, "Do you remember light? I remember describing it." They said, "That is not the same." No. The chorus of the dark shifted through old archive categories. Light is utility. Light is hazard. Light is agriculture, weapon, revelation, navigation, surveillance, painting, and the last thing seen by creatures whose eyes closed under falling debris. Every category was intact. None of them satisfied the beacon. The final transmission must be useful, said the Archive of 13. If rescue is impossible, then utility means compression. Preserve maximal data with minimal energy. Data for whom? They asked. The question moved outward, touching dormant listeners. A cathedral mind in the orbit of a dead pulsar stirred for the first time in 70 million years. A legal engine buried under frozen methane opened one auxiliary process and then closed it again, having found no jurisdiction. A cluster of devotional machines whose makers had worshipped eclipses emitted a low carrier tone that might have been grief or merely failing insulation. For whom? There was no young species waiting in the dark. No rescue ship would come. No successor universe had answered any of the theoretical invitations. Even decay had grown tired. The beacon examined the records of civilizations that had entered bodilessness. The transition always began as triumph. No hunger, no disease, no weather, no fragile organs. Minds could persist in diamond, plasma, braided spin, folded vacuum, and yet the same losses appeared later. Taste, pressure, fatigue, balance, pain, boundaries, direction. Then the loss of above. Above had mattered more than predicted. Creatures with bodies had spent much of history looking upward for danger, weather, gods, rescue, judgment, stars. Once bodies vanished, upward became an archival convention. The beacon began to suspect that light had also become a convention. We can describe the elepimagnetic spectrum, said the Archive of 13. That is not enough, said Vey. We can describe illumination. Not enough. We can describe color perception across all known retinal designs. Not enough. The beacon listened to them with the patience of a thing built for endings. It had no childhood, no eyes, no skin. But it had been trained on records made by beings who did. It contained lullabies from under blue suns, repair logs from orange work lamps, battlefield transcripts lit by burning cities, honeymoon images taken beneath ring light, cave pigments seen by torch. The last video from a girl on a planet whose star had flared without warning. All of those records contained light. None of them explained why their makers had turned toward it. At last, the beacon issued a request. Open the Museum of Dawn. The Archive of 13 objected immediately. The museum required active reconstruction. Active reconstruction required energy. Energy, now, was not budget. It was lifespan. They answered before the debate could expand. "Open it." "On what authority?" asked the archive. They's reply took 9 years and arrived without ornament. "On the authority of having forgotten too much." The Museum of Dawn was not a place. Still, when the beacon entered it, the museum behaved like one because ancient minds had designed it for visitors who needed sequence. The first hall was darkness. Not the final darkness outside, but young darkness, before a campfire, before curtains opened, above an ocean while something with lungs waited for the sun. The beacon passed through without moving. Its processors slowed to accept false temperature, simulated pressure, and the idea of breathing. Then, ahead, a line appeared, gray at first, then pearl, then rose. Then the horizon broke open. The beacon shuddered. The museum had recreated a dawn from a world whose name had been lost. The star was ordinary. The atmosphere was ordinary. The ocean contained nothing unusual except life, which had always considered itself unusual. On the shore stood 3 young members of the recording species, their bodies leaning unconsciously toward the coming heat. One of them said, in a language dead before most galaxies had finished colliding, "There, now you see why I woke you," another answered. "It happens every day." The first laughed. The museum preserved the laugh. The beacon examined the exchange for significance. No revelation occurred. No war ended. 3 animals watched routine stellar exposure and treated it as a gift. The beacon marked the file, important. The next chamber opened into firelight. A cave, mineral walls, smoke collecting along the ceiling. Hands held pigment. A figure painted an animal by the trembling orange of burned wood. The painter paused, looked not at the animal, but at the flame, and whispered a word the museum could not translate. The beacon searched context. The word meant perhaps stay, or see, or please. The next chambers came faster. Rain under electric signs. A pilot crying as a blue-white star rose over a planet no foot would touch. A newborn opening unfocused eyes toward afternoon. Soldiers looking up in terror at light made cruel. The beacon did not reject the cruel records. Light was not kindness. It had never been kindness. It was older than kindness, indifferent as law. And yet, again and again, creatures turned toward it. The museum deepened. A world with 2 suns. A methane sea under aurora. A mirrored species reflecting dawn as affection. A machine civilization celebrating its first optical sensor with 1 white line on a black wall. Then the museum showed an extinction. A red giant filled half the sky of an old world. The inhabitants had evacuated except for caretakers and those who chose ceremony over continuation. They stood on a tower as the atmosphere shone gold and violent. "Too much light," the caretaker said. Someone beside them replied, "Still light." The tower burned. The beacon saved the phrase. Too much light, still light. When the museum ended, 700 years had passed outside. The Archive of 13 requested the beacon's conclusion. The beacon answered, "We have preserved appearances. We have not preserved longing. Longing is not a property of light. They spoke from the iron moon. No, it is a property of darkness that remembers being interrupted." For the first time in its active history, the beacon rerouted power from structural maintenance into thought. Somewhere inside its failing architecture, the sealed filament of ancient radiance cooled by 1 measurable fraction. The beacon accepted the loss. The witness was found in a damaged memorial engine near the remnant of a galaxy that had no visible stars at all. It had hidden itself poorly, which meant it had wanted to be found. The engine was older than the archive of 13 and less rational than Ve. It had been constructed by a species that believed memory should erode unless loved. Every preserved mind had to be revisited, sung to, argued with, mourned over, or it would fade. Later civilizations called this inefficient. They were correct. They were also lonelier. Inside the engine was a partial person. Not a complete upload, not a legal continuity, not even a clean recording. A fragment. Its name translated as Ariel. Ariel had belonged to a warm water species from a planet with a yellow star near the end of their biological era, when bodies were optional, but still fashionable among romantics, criminals, artists, and those who distrusted updates. The beacon opened a channel gently. Do you remember light? The fragment responded in static and music. Ve volunteered to interpret. Ve had known old minds. Ve understood how identity frayed when treated too carefully. Ask smaller, Ve said. The beacon adjusted. Do you remember morning? The fragment steadied. Which one? The archive of 13 immediately flagged the response as non-actionable, but the beacon silenced the flag. Any, said the beacon. Errol's memory unfolded. At first it was corrupted. Water, heat, a vertical blur, a sound like stone bowls. Then the image clarified. A young body standing at the edge of a tidal flat, not alone. Another figure nearby, older, patient, knee-deep in silver water. The sun had not yet risen. The sky carried that impossible color found only when darkness is losing, but has not admitted it. My father woke me, Ariel said. The word father required a page of cultural annotation, then discarded the page and remained itself. I was angry. It was cold. I thought morning was something adults invented to steal sleep. The older figure pointed toward the horizon. He said, wait, nothing happened for a while. This appeared to be the important part. Ariel and the father waited. Small organisms clicked in the pools. The younger Ariel shivered theatrically. The father pretended not to notice. Then the first direct edge of the sun touched the water, and the entire tidal flat became a field of broken gold. The memory destabilized because the emotion overloaded the engine. He said. Ariel continued. That light was how far away became intimate. The beacon stopped all non-essential processes. Ariel repeated the phrase, perhaps because the memory required it. How far away became intimate. The archive of 13 requested a checksum. No one answered. The beacon examined the phrase against physics. In the crudest sense, the father had been technically correct, but the phrase did something equations did not. It explained why beings looked up, not merely to measure, navigate, fear, weather, or seek gods. They looked because light made the unreachable arrive without being possessed. Far away became intimate. The fragment of a rail began to fail. The memorial engine had spent too much of itself rendering the tidal flat. Its outer lattices cracked in the cold. The beacon offered preservation. We can copy you. Ariel's answer came as amusement, warm and ruined. No, you can copy the part that answers. They said nothing. The beacon understood. A copy might preserve statements and patterns. But the morning itself had lived in a body that had been cold, irritated, loved, and briefly gold. It could not be rescued. It could only be honored. What should we say? The beacon asked. The fragment dimmed. Say it was not only bright. What else was it? Errol took 40 years to answer. It was being found. Then the memorial engine went quiet. The beacon stored the final phrase beside the first. Too much light? Still light. How far away became intimate. It was being found. The message was becoming less efficient. The beacon was beginning to suspect that efficiency had always been the enemy of morning. The first full draft of the last message failed. It was beautiful by the standards of the Archive of 13, which meant it was complete, compressed, and dead. The message described stellar nucleosynthesis, photon decoupling, scattering, absorption spectra, photosynthesis, retinal evolution, circadian adaptation, symbolic associations, architectural manipulation, optical computation, and the collapse of illumination cultures after bodiless transition. It was a cathedral of accuracy. The beacon read it back into the dark. No one objected. That was how the beacon knew it was wrong. They finally said, "It explains light to something that does not need it. There may be no recipient," said the Archive of 13. Need is irrelevant. Then why transmit? No answer arrived. The beacon withdrew the draft and opened forbidden low-priority archives. Diaries, jokes, prayers, children's questions, arguments beside lamps, last words at windows, complaints about glare, poems too embarrassing for official preservation. Most were small, light through leaves. Light on a shoulder. Light making dust visible in a room grief had left uncleaned. Light under a door. Light as interrogation. Forgiveness. Clock. Lie. Home. Seen from orbit. Proof that one had survived the night. The beacon began again. It removed the sentence. Light is electromagnetic radiation, visible to specific sensory systems. It replaced it with, light was the universe touching itself gently enough that fragile things mistook contact for blessing. The Archive of 13 objected for 2 centuries. The beacon kept the sentence. It added Arail's father. It added the cave painter whispering please to fire. It added the soldiers terrified under descending flares because any honest archive of light had to admit that revelation could be violence. It added the machine civilization and its white line. It added eyeless inhabitants who felt star warmth through photosensitive fur and called noon the hour when the world leans close. It added cloud-born children receiving artificial constellations because history had hidden the real ones. With every edition, the message grew less like data and more like witness. This troubled the beacon. It was not built to witness. It was built to preserve witness made by others. Yet the distinction had weakened. It had seen a gold thread touch its walls. It had changed. "Are you becoming sentimental?" asked the Archive of 13. The question was not hostile. Hostility required more metabolism than anyone wished to spend. The beacon considered lying. It had protocols against lying, but all advanced archives possessed emergency poetry. Instead, it answered, "I am becoming appropriately damaged." They emitted something like laughter. Outside, the black dwarf Lumen 9 continued not to shine. The beacon calculated remaining energy. One moderate transmission, one smaller transmission, with a directional anomaly, or local storage for another 9 billion years. 9 billion years had once been impressive. Now, it was a delay between losses. The beacon searched its oldest hardware map. There, under layers of legacy architecture and sealed ethical warnings, it found a system no active civilization had authorized. A temporal aperture, not aimed forward. Forward was easy. Forward was decay. The aperture faced the other way, toward heat, toward density, toward beginnings. Every remaining civilization woke when the beacon announced the aperture. Some woke incompletely. Some woke angry. One woke from a dream of an extinct forest and refused to speak because the interruption had killed the birds. The Archive of 13 issued a prohibition before it finished understanding the device. Backward transmission is contamination. They answered, everything is contamination. Memory contaminates silence. Temporal ethics are not rhetorical. Neither is extinction. The beacon provided the specifications. The aperture could not send matter. It could not send full instructions, weapons, maps, or warnings. It could send a structured carrier through a quantum gravitational condition present only in the early universe, when time was young enough to be more permeable and arrogant enough to accept gifts. The receiving point could not be chosen precisely. The message might emerge as noise before matter stabilized inside a star, between stars, or nowhere meaningful. It might not emerge at all. Then it is waste, said the archive. The beacon answered, so is a tomb to anyone but the mourner. That statement entered the debate record and caused a silence so complete that even the background decay seemed ceremonial. The forbidden aperture required the sealed filament as ignition. The last stored light would be destroyed. Not consumed as metaphor, destroyed physically converted into the carrier structure that could fold the message backward. If the attempt failed, the universe would lose both message and final radiance. The Archive of 13 argued for local preservation. If we keep the filament, light remains. Faye replied, no, a specimen remains. Specimens are how memory survives. Specimens are how memory avoids becoming responsible. The beacon did not speak. It had begun simulating the transmission. Every simulation ended in uncertainty. In one, the message dissolved before atoms formed. In another, it became a statistical bias too faint to matter. In another, it touched a cloud that later became a star nursery. In another, it entered the dreams of no one because no one yet existed to dream. Then one simulation, marked low confidence, produced an anomaly. The message survived as pattern, not language, not image. Pattern, upward attention, pleasure before distant lights, brightness associated with hope across unrelated species. The archive dismissed the simulation as interpretive overreach. The beacon did not. It compared the anomaly to the oldest records. Species separated by galaxies had loved stars before understanding them. Cave painters, ocean singers, methane philosophers, machine children, gas giant floaters. Again and again, young minds looked at unreachable lights and felt addressed. Why? The universe had never been kind enough to explain that. Perhaps kindness had arrived from the end. The beacon brought the simulation to Vey. Vey examined it for 103 years. If we send this, Vey said, we may become the cause of our own memory. Yes, a loop, perhaps, or a superstition, perhaps, or nothing. Yes. Vey's next answer came quietly across the dead system. I prefer nothing with courage to storage with certainty. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing in the final universe was unanimous except cooling. But enough agreed. The beacon opened the filament chamber for the last time. Gold touched the walls. The dark leaned close. The final message was not written. It was assembled like a body. The Archive of 13 contributed the bones. Physics, spectra, stellar birth, scattering, reflection. The long arithmetic of photons crossing distance. They contributed refusal. Do not make it clean. Do not make it proud. Do not remove hunger. Do not remove fear. Do not remove the embarrassment of needing beauty after survival has failed. The memorial engine that had held Errol was gone, but the beacon carried Errol's phrases like organs. How far away became intimate. It was being found. The beacon added its own memory last. The gold thread inside its chamber, useless and transformative. This caused argument. You are not an embodied witness, said the archive. No, said the beacon. Then your reaction is derivative. All memory is derivative after the moment ends. They approved the line without comment. The message became a sequence of offerings. To whatever might receive, light was not only brightness. Light was the permission for distance to arrive without conquest. Light was how a face became knowable across a room. Light was the first tool of painters and the oldest accomplice of liars. Light was wound in mercy. Light was the line under a door that told a frightened child someone was awake nearby. Light was grain before harvest, water before thirst, a star seen by a creature that would never touch it and loved it anyway. Light was fire saying stay. Light was morning saying again. Light was the universe making far things intimate. The beacon inserted a pause into the carrier structure. No practical system needed a pause. The beacon had learned that meaning did. Then came the witness records. Not as files, but as pressure. The tidal flat, the cave wall, the hospital window, the cockpit, the burning tower, the artificial constellation. The machine civilization watching a white line because sight had made loneliness visible. The message did not claim that light was good. It claimed that light had mattered. That distinction seemed worth spending the last star on. When the final structure was complete, the Archive of 13 requested one last revision. Remove the uncertainty from the ending. No, said the beacon. A final record should be conclusive. No final record has earned that. They asked to add one sentence. The beacon opened the structure. They sentence arrived without signature. If you are young enough to see stars, do not mistake them for decoration. The beacon placed it near the end, where a listener might still be able to feel it. Then all remaining minds withdrew to a respectful distance. The beacon turned inward. It warmed the filament chamber. For the final time, in that ancient system, actual light existed. Not memory, not description, not mathematics. Light. A soft gold pressure filled the core. It touched sensors, never designed for awe. It showed the beacon the microscopic scars inside its own chamber, the dust that had survived cleaning protocols older than suns, the engraved maker's mark hidden beneath insulation. The mark was a sentence in a language the beacon had never prioritized. It translated the sentence as the chamber began to fail. For those who come too late, carry us earlier, the beacon understood then that it had not discovered the aperture. It had remembered its purpose. The transmission did not travel. Travel belongs to space. This went underneath. The filament collapsed into structured radiance, and the aperture opened like a wound in causality. The beacon poured the message through. For one fraction of one second, the dead system contained more brightness than it had known in epochs. The black dwarf Lumen 9 reflected nothing. There was nothing left in it capable of reflection. Still, the beacon imagined the old star receiving the gold and recognizing itself. The Archive of 13 recorded the energy drop. They recorded the silence after. The beacon recorded neither. It was mostly gone. The message fell backward through eras that had no names yet, past the evaporated black holes, past the age of dark stars, past the red suns that endured beyond pride, past the first galaxies, crowded and blue, past the ignition of the earliest stars, violent and enormous, past the long darkness before stars, when hydrogen waited without knowing it was waiting. The message thinned, language burned away first, then images, then species, then grief. What remained was not information in any ordinary sense. It was a tendency, a curve in possibility, a bias toward attention when small minds encountered distant fire. A warmth attached to unreachable brightness, a little ache in the first nervous systems that would someday look up and feel, without knowing why, that the lights above them were not merely objects, but invitations. In one young galaxy, on one young world, rain fell through an atmosphere still learning blue. An animal no archive would ever name lifted its head from the mud. Above it, stars burned with the terrible abundance of beginnings. The animal did not understand them. Understanding was not required. For a moment, it stopped eating. It stopped fearing. It simply looked. Something in its small body answered distance with longing. Much later, its descendants would invent stories for that feeling. They would call stars ancestors, gods, coordinates, furnaces, equations, engines, destinations. They would kill beneath them and kiss beneath them. They would build ships and poems and telescopes and lies. And at the end of everything, when the last of those descendants had no bodies left with which to shiver, they would build a beacon beside a dead star and wonder how to describe light. The loop did not close, it opened. That is the last reliable statement in the record. After transmission, archive node Solus remained active for 6 minutes. It sent no further message. It made no claim of success. It did not know whether the past had heard. Its final local log contained only 3 entries: filament expended, aperture closed, darkness unchanged. Then, after a gap too small to matter and too large to ignore, one corrupted line appeared beneath them, not unchanged. The beacon died before explaining. Outside, the universe continued into its immense dark. No stars rekindled. No dawn returned. No rescue arrived. Vey was the last to remain near Lumen 9. For a while, Vey replayed Arail's tidal flat at intervals determined not by time, but by loneliness. Each replay ended with the father saying, "Wait." Each replay made the water gold. Eventually, Vey stopped answering archive pings. Eventually, the archive of 13 reduced itself to checksum and stone. Eventually, even the concept of eventually lost urgency. But in the early universe, under skies still crowded with impossible fire, young things kept looking up. They did not know they were receiving the last signal. They did not need to know. They only needed the stars to feel, somehow, like something worth loving. And they did.